Happy Earth Day. Thank you all for coming out. We welcome you to the Norman Williams Public Library and the Evenings with Authors events. My name is Christian Perlowski from the Yankee Bookshop here in Woodstock. Tonight we have author Amy Godine, and she'll be in conversation with Liza Bernard about her newest book, The Black Woods, Pursuing Racial Justice on the Adirondack Frontier. Before we get started, we'd like to thank the Norman Williams Public Library for hosting this and other author talks, for being a place to gather together, and for all they do for the community. And thank Woodstock Community Television for filming and broadcasting the events, which can be found on WCTV's YouTube channel and Norman Williams' website. Yankee Bookshop will be selling books afterwards, with a portion of sales going back to the library. Please remember to take a minute to silence all phones and devices. The format tonight will be an interview and discussion with some time afterwards for audience questions. Interviewing Amy, we are honored to have Liza Bernard, the library's own programming and marketing librarian, events planner and organizer, book reviewer, and multifaceted spreader of the word. Prior to joining the library, Liza was a bookseller and one of the founders, owners, and orchestrators of the esteemed Norwich Bookstore in Norwich, Vermont for the past 3 decades, from 1994 to 2021. We're lucky to have her here sharing the knowledge and joy of books in our community. Amy Godine is an independent scholar, journalist, lecturer, and curator with an interest in the social history of the Adirondack region. She has been writing and speaking about ethnic, migratory, and Black Adirondack history since 1988. Originally from Brookline, Massachusetts, Amy got her BA in American Studies from Hampshire College. She would go on to work in editing and writing for the Heyday Press in Berkeley, California, and the Willamette Week newspaper in Portland, Oregon, followed by an MFA in fiction writing from the Iowa Writers Workshop. In the years since, she's continued to work as a teacher, writer, and lecturer, receiving numerous awards, fellowships, and residencies. Since 1980, she's been living in Saratoga Springs, New York. Her latest book is The Black Woods, which chronicles the history of Black pioneers in New York's northern wilderness. Please join me in welcoming Liza Bernard and Amy Godine.
And to get to talk about this, I've talked about this story several times in Vermont, in Norwich, and on Vermont Public Radio for the Historical Association, and in Manchester as well. And it's interesting to me that it interests Vermonters. It should, because there are several ties to Vermont in this book that aren't obvious at first glimpse from the jacket copy, and I think they're fascinating. Maybe we can talk about them later on.
Mm-hmm.
But what got me into the story, not to jump ahead to questions, but I had been writing about ethnic history in the Adirondacks for a long time and had curated several exhibits on Adirondack ethnic enclaves and communities in the region, which isn't how people think about the Adirondacks. So this was always fresh news to people who discovered it, as it was for me and a social activist who'd started a group called John Brown Lives, because John Brown, the abolitionist, lived in the Adirondacks, approached me to do an exhibition, to curate a small exhibit at the John Brown, well, in the Adirondacks, about the Black community. She had lived in the region and had attracted John Brown and his family and incited them to move to this region. And she thought, she hadn't read a thing about this. She thought it would be a great subject for an exhibit. And I told her I didn't think so at all. I'd read everything there was to read about it. And it was a big zero. Nobody showed up. If anybody came, they left within a year. There was no there at all. And she said, well, give it a try. Let's look together, see what we turn up. And as it happened, it was a much richer story than what the history books, most of them 19th century antiquarian histories, had suggested. So that became part of my final story too, how the story was misrepresented and kind of disappeared by the historians for 100 years or so. So there were 2 stories to capture. One, what really happened, how many people did come, how long did they stay, were they as abjectly pathetic at farming and hopeless and unsuited to Vermont as historians suggested, or did they in fact make out much better than the books represented them to have done? And I found the latter was the case, and that was a very happy and thrilling discovery to go family by family by family through these small settlements in this one part of the Adirondacks. How many people here have been to the Adirondacks and know? So you're here partly because of that. You know the region and you're interested in it, I'm assuming. Um, this is the part of the Adirondacks that spans Essex and Franklin County. If you know Lake Placid, it moves from Lake Placid north into Franklin County toward Malone. It doesn't go as far east as Elizabethtown, but it approaches it. And it's not a big pocket, but it was about 120,000 acres of land that this rich white abolitionist gave away to 3,000 poor Black New Yorkers, 3,000 men who could not vote because they did not have enough property in land to qualify for the vote in New York State. If you were Black, you had to have $250 worth of property. And very few people in New York, never mind Black, poor residents of the state, had anything like this. So this ruling since 1821 to 1870 effectively disenfranchised all of Black New York, except for a tiny elite number of people. Um, Garrett Smith's aim was to enfranchise Black men so they could vote their interests, specifically the anti-slavery ballot, but also anything to do with Black civil rights in New York. And that's why he gave away this enormous piece of land to 3,000 people. He knew that with land in hand, they could not only get out of New York City, where most of them live, but achieve the economic independence and the gain, the livelihood to entitle them to the franchise. That's the backstory of the book, the political angle of the book that was completely missing from the historical record. And that was our first discovery as we researched this book. It was the importance of the vote, the central role of the vote and the cause of enfranchisement in developing this initiative. And it was the secondarily, really wholly missing from the story was the crucial role of the 12 men, of whom I think, well, the majority were Black and a few were white, to recruit the 3,000 deed holders to get their names on the deeds and get the deeds into their hands. And that's Garrett Smith knew he couldn't do. He didn't have the resources, he didn't have the contacts. He lived in tiny Peterborough in Western New York. He needed friends in the Black communities in the cities of New York State to tap the people in their own neighborhoods and say, are you up for this amazing opportunity? And the only people who helped him were the Black agents. They were the ones who had the contacts. They were all men of extreme um, stature in their communities. They were newspaper publishers, writers, activists, and men of the cloth. They were almost all of them clergymen, and they commanded great respect. And their word, when they vetted their prospects, their eligible grantees, was solid. And Garrett Smith never questioned anybody they recommended. They also wrote him and said, I take it back. That guy is a blockhead or a dunce or unfit for a deed. I made a mistake. Let's replace him with this name. I mean, they weren't afraid to go back and edit their list. So within 2 years, the land is parceled out. That's an amazing accomplishment to get 3,000 names into the hands of Black New Yorkers in that time. And that's the first third of the book, tracking how this effort was pitched, how it was made popular, and how it won all kinds of acclaim in newspapers, Black and white, in churches, in civil rights groups, in temperance movement meetings, and so forth. And that's a sort of happy, hopeful, let's go part of the story. Then we sort of hit the ground with a thud when we get to what happened. And that's a more complicated and nuanced and problematic story. At the end of the day, very few of the grantees actually moved to their land. Out of 3,000 men, it's a pittance. Maybe 150, maybe 100 grantees actually take their deeds and move to the land. Most of them don't stay. Maybe 300 people stay there. That's including men and women and the deed holders and collateral relatives, grandparents, and so forth. And fellow travelers who like the idea of this but don't qualify for deeds but want to participate. And white sympathizers too, like John Brown and his family who moved there. And Garrett Smith writes it off very quickly. He says, I made a mistake here. I overestimated the capacity of Black New Yorkers to take advantage of this gift and make something out of it. And he turns his back and moves on to other initiatives fast. I'm probably telling more than
Well, that's okay.
I
There's
should.
questions coming up.
Okay. And so there's two ways to look at the story. And one way I think the book breaks new ground is to not just take Garrett Smith's appraisal, which historians did, and take that as gospel, but to step back and say, let's look aside from away from his wounded pride and look at what actually happened to those families on the ground, the families that stay there on their own terms, given the lack of support they got from their benefactor, given their dire poverty, their lack of expertise in northern farming. This was totally new to them. Their absence of familiarity with this terrain and with their white neighbors, their concerns about their safety, given the threat of the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850. What does it say that 20 families stayed in Franklin County and 20 families stayed in Essex County and stayed in some cases for generations? And in fact, the last descendant of one of these families only died 3 years ago. That's how long some of the families lasted in the region. So I look at it from two perspectives. I acknowledge Garrett Smith's distress, but I also stick with the grantees on the land and see how it was for them. From their view, abandoned by their benefactor, ignored by the agents who would help them get their deeds after a certain point. The agents moved on to other civil rights interests. Out of sight of the Black press at this time, sort of considered an embarrassment. Even Frederick Douglass, who was completely in the corner of this initially, backed away and said, don't come up with any fancy plans for Black farming. It doesn't work out. Black people aren't meant to farm. They want to be in cities or they want to be around the safety of neighborhoods and urban areas. This is a mistake. So Douglass moves away. Their best friends in the Black community have deserted them, and still they stick with their farms. And they build communities and neighborhood liaisons and friendships and a good rep, a good name in these very rural communities. So that's the second part of the book, tracking its fate in the public imagination, but also on the ground where they were living. And in the last third of the book, I really look at how this story was told, how it was manipulated, what went missing, what dropped out of the picture, and how it was recovered in this century by first social activists like my friend and me, but also several local historians who felt there was something missing in their local histories and they wanted to get to the bottom of this. And um, environmentalists, archaeologists, artists, novelists. Russell Banks wrote a marvelous book about this episode called Cloud Splitter. Um, Historians have embraced different parts of it and tried to recenter the Black story here, but it's a tough challenge because the evidence is very thin on the ground. You have to go completely to primary records because the secondary records can't be trusted, and the primary records regarding a population that was illiterate and not documenting its own experience for itself are pretty thin on the ground. So that took a lot of digging. And so the story has many ups and a lot of downs too, but ultimately it ends on an affirmative note, I think.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that's true. I will admit that I had absolutely no idea about these land gifts at all. It
Well,
never,
why would you? I
well,
mean, you know.
history, high school history, college history, you would think there would have been some mention, but I had absolutely no idea. And there are connections to Vermont. We can talk about that. But one of the things that struck me was that Garrett Smith inherited this land that he gave away.
Yeah.
And it wasn't prime farmland. And he was expecting untrained farmers to come and farm it. And the other thing he did that I thought was sort of interesting, and I'm wondering if this came out in any of the research, is why he did it in checkerboard formation rather than planned communities. It turned out that, if I read it right, people swapped land so they could be near other people in the community. So if he had determined that urban living was important because of community, why was that not at least attempted to be recreated?
Oh, I think he had a horror of urban living and of Black neighborhoods in particular. He
Oh.
wanted to break up Black neighborliness and create completely integrated communities. I think that was his master plan. He felt the Black the Black settlers would gain by associating with their white neighbors. They needed that association. The white neighbors needed the exposure to their new Black neighbors
Okay.
to recognize the justice of this cause and their obligations as good neighbors to help them out.
And some of that did happen.
It did. Some of it happened and sometimes it didn't.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
But what's interesting is what you say. Everybody in the Adirondacks that I've ever studied uh, renegotiates their land to accommodate their social preferences. So, like it or not, there are French Canadas, there are little Irish towns, there are little Polander Hills, there are little Jerusalems, and there are small Black enclaves, which he never saw coming and never acknowledged, called Timbuktu and Freedom's Home and Blacksville and Negro Hill and Negro Brook, both of which were recently renamed by social activists for the men who lived near them and their families, the Black families, to deracialize those names.
So his goal wasn't necessarily to make farmers or to make farmers out of the people he brought up from the city, but more to have them enfranchised to vote for abolition.
I think he saw both goals as absolutely crucial and ungainable without the other. I think he hoped to create an integrated frontier, and he despised abolitionist friends who were uncomfortable with Black people in their physical presence and didn't want Black neighbors and wanted to marginalize and sectionalize Black communities like this, create all Black worlds. That wasn't his idea, nor was it the idea of the Black agents who helped him. They really liked the part of it that messed up the map and created a true checkerboard out of it. What's interesting is the grantees aren't on board with that.
Mm-hmm.
They move next to each other. They don't create villages or towns, but they create clusters of 3 households or something. Why wouldn't they? They don't know a soul in this country. Jewish peddlers do the same thing in Tupper Lake. French Canadians do the same thing in Malone and Plattsburgh and all the little towns around. It's what people do. They go to what's familiar, comfortable, and above all, safe.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So both things are critical to him, I think.
Okay. Because I mean, one of them had a longer tail than the other, for sure.
Yeah.
For sure. And I don't want to get to the longer tail yet. So you said that you had there was just no history there was nothing there. You had to work in the marginalia, is what you said, and anecdotes and things like that to pull some of these stories together.
Yeah.
And I think that really speaks to how we talk about historical facts, but we rarely talk about who's presenting the facts.
Mm-hmm.
And so where did you find the facts that were hard to dig out? What was your research process like?
Well, in the beginning, I relied on a town history by a really capable town historian in Lake Placid, North Elba, which contained most of these grantees. And this woman made it her absolute mission to include the Black story in this history and account for every single family, what they owned. How that was a huge resource to me, that book. What she didn't do, and this is the nemesis of town history, was reach outside the border of her town into the larger historical picture. She couldn't be concerned with the political backdrop of the story that gave rise to these gifts in the first place, because that was not her department. Her department was to stay local and go deep. She couldn't go 10 miles to the north where all of these other little communities were in these other towns right near North Elba, because she had to go down and they had their own town historian, and that would be stepping on this other woman's turf. We used to talk about this, and I'd say, how come you never deal with transient people coming into North Elba, like the peddlers or like circuses or like traveling preachers? And she said, well, they didn't put down roots. This what really wasn't their place. It wasn't. And so it was very lococentric and very boosterish and very limited, even though deep she went, and she provided me with a world of, unfortunately, she never gave her sources for anything, but I had to trust a lot of what she suggested was correct. So that was one level. And then hitting the point where I saw what her blinders were and I had to go past them, pitched me into the various regional archives where I could look at more directly at legal records in the county archives, at tax records in the state archives, at military records in the National Archives, which was probably my best source of seriously colorful, interesting, personal information about.
I found your 80, it's just 80 pages of notes in this book.
Oh, but that's good. You don't have to read those. So it's this much less thick if you take that away.
No, but I was going back to them because there are some really interesting nuggets of connections back there that you touch on in the narrative, but it's where they came from that I found fascinating.
It's pretty interesting stuff.
Yeah,
I love those notes, but I don't expect anyone else would.
But in your research, how did you deal with the coded and or explicit racism that you had to plow through?
Well, I can't say I'm exempt from this. I realized at the very end of the process of writing this book, and it was a really late insight for me, that I'd never really explored the roots of Garrett Smith's own land fortune in his father's larcenous seizure, really, of land from Native Americans throughout northern New York. And that the Native story is very much part of this story in a way, how Garrett Smith got land from his father, a serious land baron, passed it on to Black settler, what is the word? Settler colonists, colonialists? I forget, but you know what I'm saying. People who had no idea that they were on land that had been usurped and gained under fraudulent terms by a white speculator 40 years before or 50 years before, and wouldn't realize this, but we see it now and we think, well, what does that mean for this experiment? What new light does that shed on this? Do we then see them in terms of how we see Western pioneers? This is a way I hadn't thought about this story at all. So one thing I hope I brought to my own research was a measure of some humility about my own limits as a reader. And as I came to realize by the end of this, it's just a matter of decades or maybe weeks or days before someone comes up with another version of this that brings entirely fresh vantages to this story that will displace this and take it to a new place. So I can't say I felt the pain I think you're suggesting I might have felt. I felt more just a kind of humbleness about what I was going to miss and how I had to just take that for granted. They were going to be missed stuff.
Because I thought it was interesting that there are people who said that the settler, the black people who came up from the city went back and failed because they didn't have the skills, or it reinforced the stereotypes that they were lazy.
Oh,
But
yeah.
but basically they didn't have the resources or the training, and some of them actually left not to go back to the city, but to head to places where, some to Vermont, but others out west where the land was even better.
I think I see what you were asking. I thought you were asking about right now how I,
Well, that both.
yeah. Yes, there was no shortage of historians using this story, exploiting this story as a way to racialize Black entitlement to claiming some role in, say, Adirondack history. In Vermont, there would be versions of this too, using this story as a way to say, you don't belong here, you didn't cut it. Here is the classic example. There's a reason why this story isn't, even though it's a very small slice of Adirondack history, it's in every Adirondack history book. There's always a chapter on John Brown and Timbuktu. John Brown is always the hero, the right-thinking, focused, organized abolitionist martyr hero whose industry puts the Black settlers to shame, even while no Black settlers in those accounts are ever named, or their stories are never followed, even though they stay and farm and stay on their farms. And John Brown deserts him. So the story, from the first expressions of it in the mid-century, is racialized as a showpiece of Black incapacity and unfitness for the rigors of the pioneering life. And it's got a tacit message that you don't belong and you never will. And that's something I hope I challenged.
Yeah, you definitely did. And it goes back to who gets to tell the story.
Yes, right.
Yeah. Which is still a question we have. And you talk about the regional narratives. I mean, the Adirondacks are a unique place. And I'm wondering how much this story or this experience went towards making the Adirondacks what it is now.
Well, I think it expressed, as so many Adirondack stories do, an obsession with purity, an idea of an Adirondack idealized purity, an environmental purity when we think about the region. But this story, as part of that tradition, shows the sort of riskiness of that emphasis and how it can be extended to a social purity, a racial purity, that you come here as much as anything, not just to get clean air, not just to get fresh water, not just to get your health back, but to leave the city behind, and what the city means in terms of undesirable company, of people you don't want to be around. And that would include poor people, immigrants, certainly Black people. And this is one more story that makes that point. And you can't forget how much of the Adirondack Park is made up of private parks, established by the very wealthy, environmentally driven, but also with social agendas of their own, to keep people out of their preserves as much as to let the park in to defend its borders. So that's another part of the story. Yeah.
That's true. So as far as the successes of Garrett Smith's experiment, because it was a grand experiment,
Yeah.
an experiment on a grand scale, it had some unforeseen positive outcomes, such as having people vote. People hung on to the land until the Voting Rights Act passed.
Yeah, he didn't see that coming.
1870. So what other long tail?
Well, that's a really good one. He didn't anticipate that Black deed holders, many of them gave up their land because they couldn't afford to pay the back taxes. So eventually the state steps in, reclaims the land at auction, and parcels it out again. And you see Garrett Smith buying land back that he'd given the grantees down the road and his land agents, right? He's an operator and a businessman. But many of the grantees as well are speculating in his land and buying up lots of land from neighbors and friends who have no use for it and can use the money. So they're buying land and selling it and flipping it and making a profit on it, which is what you're supposed to do if you're a good speculator. And one of them buys up enough land to, he has about 500 acres or so of Adirondack land in what is now the site of two great camps, Uncas and Sagamore, which I think you've been to. Has anyone else been to these? They're historic sites, far away from the Smith gift land. But this guy, who was a big time Black civil rights activist and a restaurateur and a caterer with a looming reputation in Black justice issues, he leaves at his death this chunk of land to his grown children who discover they've inherited what is a kind of Adirondack duchy in the heart of the region. The problem is that their father failed to ever um, sign his deeds and register them properly with the county clerk, so they weren't legalized. And the children decide to take the owners of the land to court. The owners are, if I remember right, William Roosevelt, J.P. Morgan, and somebody Northrop, who's the former Attorney General of New York, I think, and big players, in other words, who've built enormous great camps. And the hope of, of expelling them from this land is obviously ridiculous, but they hope to win a settlement. And that's what I hope to find. But I was never able to track the fate of this lawsuit, which was a big deal in the press when it exploded. It moved from the Times to the West Coast to the South. Negro heirs to land fight great landowners. It was hot. And the Democratic press finally, is probably the first time, jumped all over this because it was a class war. They didn't care about the rights of Black people. They were interested in poor people who got land unseating these captains of Republican industry and power. And I wish I'd found anything to suggest what happened to it, but my guess is the judge dismissed it out of hand. And he said, "What are you talking about? He didn't own the land. You don't get anything," because he didn't get anything legally. It doesn't even come up as a resolution in a paper.
Wow.
But what a cool story.
It's a great story. There's
yeah.
the other story about the there was a man who was a formerly enslaved man who had property. He was taken by the Fugitive Act. He had a wife and two kids. The two kids were, or they were here. I don't remember the exact order of things, but the two kids were sold off, so their last name was changed.
Oh, yeah.
And they were slaves, so the wife didn't get the man's last name.
Yeah.
And because of the difference in names, he couldn't prove, or they couldn't prove ownership of the deed.
Yeah.
And they lost the land. And I thought, oh my God, we're still there.
That was a sad story to report
it's a horrible
because
story. But it had to do with how slavery was still
right.
majorly affecting how this process fell out.
Yeah, that was a very interesting story. I'll try and summarize it, though it's a hard one to do. A very famous Black abolitionist, orator, and activist in New York City named James Pennington, who was himself an escaped slave, um, um, left enslavement when he was a young man, moves to New York. 10 years later, at least, his brother shows up in New York City with his two children. He's made his escape too. He hasn't seen his older brother in years. This is carefully orchestrated by the Underground Railroad to get him to New York, to Pennington's apartment. Pennington takes him to a safe house in New York City, lower New York, and goes home after a passionate reunion with his brother and these two teenage nephews he's never met, anticipating the next day that they will start their new lives. But in the middle of the night, his brother, Stephen Pembroke, another name, the original name, has been tracked by police working for the owners from whom he's escaped. They crash into the apartment, sees him and the boys, put them in jail. Before dawn, a judge has been roused who's pro-slavery, who declares them property of escaped property who have to be returned. And before Pennington and an attorney can even raise any legal help for them, they are being whisked back to Maryland, to the South. The father, with the help of Frederick Douglass, gets his freedom and moves back to New York. His sons he never sees again. They're instantly separated, sold to Kentucky enslavers, and then sold again to Alabama, where they're given new names every set of the way. This is slavery. You get the names of your master everywhere you go. Okay, years later, some property, and when the Adirondacks is changing and becoming a resort area, and every lakeside front looks like a promising site for a magnificent hotel, two Adirondack wheeler dealers have their eye on one beautiful piece of land they want to fix a hotel on. One of them is squatted there to make his claim, but the other one knows if he can find the owner of the original deed to this land, he has a better chance in court and he can unseat the squatter. Incidentally, both these guys have family ties to John Brown, so it's even more twisted than you can imagine. They're both descendants of abolitionists. But anyway, they're after this piece of land. The one who has his eyes on a deed tracks down the McCraes, the children of the captured enslaved men who grow up in slavery in a plantation. By the time that this guy's attorney reaches these two men, they're in middle age, they're sharecroppers on this farm, and he finds a lawyer in their little town in, I think it's Greensboro, Alabama, who himself was a leading officer in the Confederate Army, but says, sure, I'll track down these two colored men and let them know, because it must be such an amazing story for him. Let them know they've inherited a piece of the Adirondacks, a gorgeous lakefront property, and if they'll let it go for this much money, it's theirs. And then it's this guy's property in clear. The two men are brought in to the lawyer's office. Yes, they sign off. This is more money they've seen in this or any other lifetime. It's a pittance compared to what it's worth. It's actually worth $50,000, but they are happy to take 500, which is what they're going to get. And the owners are thrilled. The new owners are delighted. They've got legal stake in the land, and that's when it starts. That's when it goes to court, and then goes to court again 3 times before it's resolved. At first, it's resolved in their favor by a judge who insists that the jury rule in favor of them because he doesn't trust this Adirondack jury to rule in favor of the law, which says he deserves the land, he bought the deed, but will favor the squatter who's a local hero. So then it goes to Albany, it goes down to the state, and that's where the judge votes in favor of depriving the new owner of his right to this property because the judge isn't persuaded that the men who are sharecroppers were necessarily the son of the man whose last name they don't share. Of course they don't share his last name. They were separated from him when they were 13. Witnesses are brought up from the South to testify for them. Pennington's own son comes, a Civil War vet, who testifies for them, who goes all the way to the Adirondacks to go to county court. So does Garrett Smith's son come from Peterborough. So does the daughter of one of the grantees' agents who comes up, probably the most passionate of the agents, and defends the integrity of Smith's list and what it meant to get land and how their name on this list was legit. And still the judge won't back off and says, no, we can't say for sure they were legitimate. We don't even know if his parents were married. Well, you couldn't get married at that time. Formal marriage was illegal. So yes, it showcases northern racism.
Yeah.
And it says this was as complicit in this as anything else. And that's one thing I think the book does do successfully, is
Absolutely.
underscore the meaning of say this wasn't a Southern story, this was a national story.
So it really
Yeah.
challenges the stories that they're telling each other.
Yeah,
Because the truth is so much deeper.
yeah.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of the grantees also held on to the land for sentimental reasons. Certainly, we know that they held on to it for the right to vote, for the power it gained them at the voting booth. If you had a deed, it proved, which was gaining value every year, you could raise enough, you could get your means to the point where you were eligible for the vote. You had that $250 between what you earned and that piece of paper. So you held on to it, and then you gave it up in 1870 when the right to vote, thanks to the constitutional amendment, was
Right.
given to every American. Yeah, but not before.
Yep. 15th Amendment.
Yeah.
So at that point, I'd like to open up questions because I've still got more, but do people here have questions for Amy? Yes.
If you had to rewrite the book today after the printing,
Ah,
what would you put in it?
Oh, interesting question.
oh, that's such a nice question because I took so much out to accommodate, the need for flow. Um, I think I do more to locate the story in the national scene and talk about similar efforts to create Black communities in the West and in the South after the Civil War, and what happened with those and how this was different. I think that would be interesting for people to know and to understand that there were efforts from Maine to Oregon to create Black communities that were above all economically independent, but also civically independent and empowered, and to give it that kind of national frame. That would be interesting. I'd also want to track, as I did in a chapter I abandoned, Garrett Smith's disavowal of this kind of initiative after the Civil War, when he was approached by a number of white um, reformers who go south hoping to start Black farm colonies. And some of them were opportunists and lived up to the evil reputation of the carpetbagger, but many of them weren't. And they had grand plans knowing of this effort and assuming Garrett Smith would be on board. And he never gave a dime to any of these prospects, and none of them did take off. For a range of structural reasons in the South, having less to do with Smith than intransigent Southern racism. That would be an interesting thing too. What would you like to see? Because you've read the book.
I'd like to point out to you from the boat.
Well, that's not going to happen, honey. So we're going to give up on that one. But I can step up there. That's all right. Yeah. Yeah. Well, it was my best defense against writing a really boring book. I think I really mean it. I mean, I did a kind of steeping in scholarly literature about this history. I'm not a history major. I don't have a degree in history, and I was starting from scratch, introducing myself to abolitionist politics and culture, and what was happening with Black New Yorkers at that time and nationally too. And a lot of it was very dull and very dry and always informative and interesting. But if you surround yourself with boring company, you can get really boring yourself. And I just kept having to go back to really well-written fiction to remember how to tell a story and recall the lessons of what I loved about a good read, and that making people want to turn the page is sort of the first obligation, and that doesn't come with a steady diet of facts. You have to learn how to, and it's difficult when you have so little to work with. There are times in the book when I hypothesize about how people were feeling or what they were doing in a much more granular way than I could ever document. but I think I covered my bets by always clarifying these were inventions, or at least imaginings that seemed probable to me. And so without that, it would have been, a, it would be an ordeal to read. And I was glad I had those skills from the fiction writing I love and some of what I did to be able to bring those to bear in the book. It was a blessing for me, really. And it's a part of the book people seem to love the most. Am I tempted? No, but others have been. People have been writing plays and poems and Banks's novel, and there've been some other novels too, and um, many oral events, people developing personas and um, based on certain characters. So I think it's been inspiring in that way, which is thrilling. And music also, several pieces have been written honoring this. But it is a challenge to do. I was very envious when friends of mine who were working on 20th century material or material dealing with rich people where there's a whole lot of stuff and a whole lot of documentation and a whole lot of material culture to back up everything you want to bring to life on the page. And there's not a single barn or farm or wall standing that belonged to any of the grantees who built land. Nothing. There's nothing but the headstones in 5 cemeteries that bears real witness to their presence. And of course, John Brown's farmhouse, secondarily, because he comes to help them out and then leaves within a few years to pursue his bigger battle in Kansas and Harper's Ferry.
Yeah, you said he didn't spend much time there at all.
Not a whole lot. I mean, it's not that he was indifferent to it, it's that he was always broke and in trouble with bankruptcy suits and had to try and make more money in England or in Worcester and Ohio. And so he was on the road a lot because he had to afford the life he wanted to live to fight slavery. So no, he wasn't there much. His family was.
Yeah,
they didn't
but he
stay.
wasn't.
Yeah, yeah.
Any other questions? Anything you want to add? I think I've run out of questions.
Well, do you want me to read a little something?
Sure.
Or are we out of time, or we're
No,
good?
not quite out of time.
Okay. This is from a later part of the book. Uh, when I'm tracking how the settlers make out after they've been sort of forgotten and are on their own, they're making their own way, how it goes for them. I'm tracking here, I'm instancing the way they did not thrive when the Adirondack economy turns from subsistence farming to recreation and health and an emphasis on environmental pleasures and going there to explore, hunt, recreate, gain your health back, have an adventure following Maurice Fools and all the people who came rushing to the region to explore this amazing wilderness in New York State. Um, a new service economy is created, of course, to accommodate those people and minister to their needs. And that's where the descendants of the Black farmers move. That's the niche they will occupy if they stay in the region. They go to work at the hotels. They might work as guides. They might work as laundresses and as cooks. And that's not necessarily an economic fall. It might be safer and better work, but it's not like being self-employed. It's not what Garrett Smith had in mind. It's not what their parents or grandparents had in mind. Mm-hmm. And they don't have access to capital. They don't have access to the banks. They can't get the loans. They can't get the floating start. They aren't able to move up. They keep hitting a ceiling. This is a familiar story in our country, and I see this happening in the 1880s and persisting. And this is a story of what happens when that new culture, which is more racialized all over again, which happens about a generation after the Civil War, when all the glorious talk of, of racial equality and an anti-slavery movement has subsided, and people are getting very anxious about race and worried about Black people coming up from the South, starts to take over. And you start seeing real racist stuff happening in the Adirondacks at that time. Um, Here's a story in that era about a grantee's son, a farmer, a successful farmer, but a poor farmer, who is a Civil War vet who goes south, fights, meets a former slave, an emancipated slave. He marries in the South and brings her north, and they farm together. They don't have kids, and they're out of John Brown's orbit, so he never makes it into any history because he's outside that golden circle where historians were interested to the north. But he's one of my favorite characters, and this is a story of how things go for him in 1885, when the grantee's son, Charles Henry Hazard, learned just how much his good standing in his St. Armand home could help him. That year, a county constable came to his farm with a summons from the court. Hazard had been found guilty of non-payment of a debt. The constable was here to escort the aging farmer to the county jail for 3 months. He's about 50 at this time. Hazard knew he owed the money. The debt was for a horse he had bought in Ausable Forks in 1854. Though the horse was wheezy and poor in flesh, the seller, White, promised it would rally with a little time and care. Hazard got the horse back to his farm, but when it wouldn't drink or eat and then collapsed, both hind legs snapping, he had to put it down. What was his obligation? The white veterans he tapped for advice were good neighbors and community builders like himself. 6 years earlier, he and his brother Alexander, joined ranks with 15 neighbors to found St. Armand's Brookside Cemetery, and when forest fires lunged, the Hazard men helped beat them back. Captain James H. Pierce had founded the St. Armand lumber hamlet Bloomingdale and served as its first president, town supervisor repeatedly, and postmaster. Black farmers brought potatoes to his starch factory. He backed their claims during the tax sales, and after his return from the war, their appeals for military pensions, too. Hazard's other confidant, Second Lieutenant Judson C. Ware of North Elba, was credible as well. A former county sheriff and town supervisor, he grew up in the Blackwoods. In July 1857, while John Brown was in Kansas, Ware, 3 Browns, 2 Thompsons, another abolitionist family, and the grantee's son, Simeon Hasbrook, camped out on Mount Whiteface and had themselves, wrote Annie Brown, a first-rate time, despite their ill-made, over-smoky campfire. Back from the war, Ware took the side of his black neighbors against farm seizures for back taxes, bought property from them, and saw them take their vows. And when he and Pierce reviewed Hazard's situation, they gave their best advice. This horse seller was a swindler. Harris owed them not 1 cent. But the confident reassurance of these white men, advice that might have worked for Hazard in St. Armand, could not help him where he wasn't known. Elizabethtown was only 30 miles from St. Armand, but where a black man was unvetted, the presumption of his criminality was apparently given. And when a county constable turned up at his farm, the good word of his neighbors couldn't help him. The county jail would be his home for 3 months, or would have been, but for an unexpected intervention. A decade before Hazard's case was brought to Byron Pond's attention, when this prominent Elizabethtown attorney was the Essex County judge, Pond heard white farmers in St. Armand side with the Hazards against the threat of land confiscation for back taxes. I just saw a typo. It threw me off a little. He heard about the Hazards' roomy fenced-in garden and about the 12 acres of wild grass they mowed for their animals. Pond, an estate attorney, had helped sort out Avery Hazard's will, And if Pond's occasional dealings with Gerrit Smith were strictly business, and his devotion to the anti-slavery cause no match for his older abolitionist brother, Pond still made sure he got to Deer's Head Inn in Elizabethtown for orator Wendell Phillips' remarks about John Brown's last days. In 1859, the room was packed, and Phillips lived up to his name. By 1886, Pond had served his town and county in every available capacity, county judge most famously, but also school board head, postmaster, town clerk, Republican convention delegate, and district attorney. He was 63 when he gave Charles Henry Hazard's case a look, and as far as he could see, what happened here was casebook plain. Franklin Rowe, the horse dealer's lawyer, had grossly, even criminally, overreached. Hazard had never had an opportunity to find a lawyer, plead his case, or organize an appeal. This has such topicality, doesn't it? Further, the fellow who sold him his horse never asked for or expected him to go to jail. Sheriff, constable, and attorney each had overstepped the law. Pond sought a Hazard's early release, and at Pond's insistence, the court acknowledged that Hazard's jail time was a mistake, only after extracting Hazard's promise, however, that he wouldn't countersue. It would be at Hazard's own insistence, however, that Pond pressed for more. Why, Hazard demanded, had he still to pay a fine? Was no compensation owed to him? Was no one here accountable? Pond apparently agreed and said as much to Rowe, the horse dealer's attorney. Quote, Hazard is anxious that something be collected for his being improperly kept in jail for 2 months. The plaintiff would naturally be the party to call upon in such a case, but the judge saw fit to protect him but to leave you exposed. Now, I don't like to do anything that shall look like punishing a fellow lawyer. Still, it seems under the 14th Constitutional Amendment, something must be done for the son of Ham. What do you say about it? This was delicately put, for all the condensation of that son of Ham remark, and a consoling nod to the shared fraternity of class and whiteness, Judge Pond knew that his word and reputation were not enough to force a change. The slow democracy of personal acquaintance and grassroots loyalty was by itself no guarantor of justice. Pond invoked the Constitution because pressure had to come from local vigilance and federal law alike, that is, from top and bottom both. The appeal to the highest law of the land let Rowe know Judge Pond's grasp of the stakes here. And while Pond did not spell it out, his expectation was transparent. Do more for this black man, or we may meet in court. Court costs and fine were canceled. Hazard's name was cleared. He went home early, his purse intact. These were gains, and this was something. But had a breach of justice been redressed? For Hazard's 2 months behind bars, for the blow to his and Julia's subsistence farm, half the planting season stolen, for the trauma to his once enslaved wife, who surely figured she had put these blows behind her, white men seizing, stealing people, presuming black culpability a given. For this, there was no compensation. The Hazards of St. Armand never saw a dime. Thanks.
Wow. It's a good place to end. Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
thanks. Thanks for coming
Yes.
and giving me another chance to just rattle on.